Now that we're all self-quarantined because of the coronavirus, I hope you've had a chance to do the daily readings that the church gives us. If not, now is a good time to begin. In fact, I'll put some links below so that you can find those very easily. So if you do the readings throughout the year, you'll notice, just like on a Sunday, we have an epistle reading and a gospel reading. But during Lent, something very strange happens. The church doesn't have us read from the epistle and the gospel during the weekday. Instead, they have us read from the Old Testament. The gospel is taken away from us. Why is that? Well, during Lent, it's a time of spiritual renewal. We work on our souls and intensify our prayer lives. And in fact, it's a time that the church gives us so that we can learn to hunger and thirst after God. We anticipate the resurrection of Christ and our own resurrections. In order to help us do that, the church has, strangely, taken away the gospel reading. Why? Well, by taking away the gospel reading, we are put into the desert, metaphorically, if you will, just like the Hebrews who fled Egypt. They had to go into the desert, and there they drew near to God. They received the law, and they learned how to live holy lives. If you look at the readings that we are given during Lent, the first one is taken from Isaiah. Isaiah lived during the time of the Old Testament when Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians had destroyed Jerusalem. And many of the Israelites were left wondering, why? Why were we sent into exile? What have we done wrong? Well, Isaiah tells them. He says, the kings have built comfortable lives. They've built themselves grand palaces, bigger than the temple even, and they've levied taxes and used slave labor to do this. What the kings did not do is they didn't take care of the poor, the widow, the orphan, the most vulnerable in society. As you know, that was the responsibility of the king. They're supposed to care after the nation like a father would. But the Israelite kings didn't do this. And so God punished them. He destroyed the kingdom and sent all the people into exile. This is what Isaiah explains to them. He explains how these kings had abused their power. But Isaiah doesn't stop there. He gives the Israelites hope. He says, despite all of this, there is hope. A suffering servant will come and set things right. God has not abandoned you. Things will get better, and God will draw all nations to himself. But this time of exile is a time of hungering and thirsting after God, looking forward to a time of restoration when God will renew Israel and create a holy nation. And so it creates this anticipation. And by reading it, it creates an anticipation in us to look forward to the resurrection, to look forward to the time when God will set things right. The second reading comes from Genesis. There, Scripture tells us why we live in a fallen world. We hear about the pride of Adam and Eve and how they were cast out of paradise. We also hear about the sins of humanity and how God had to instruct Noah to build an ark to save us all. But despite all of this fallenness, despite this sort of corruption, God gives us a promise. He tells Abraham that he will make him a father of many nations. He gives them a covenant, and he directs him to go into the promised land. And so the lectionary readings again is calling us to thirst and hunger after God. He gives us a promise that he will set things right. But we haven't seen it fulfilled just yet. And so we continue to hunger and thirst after the resurrection, where we see how God sets things right, how he saves our souls and pulls us up from the grave. The third reading comes from Proverbs. And there we see how we are to live our lives once we enter into the promised land. We should seek after God's wisdom. We are like the Hebrews who were in the desert. We receive God's law, we learn how to live. We learn how to love and look after one another, and we're to seek this wisdom constantly. So through the three readings, Isaiah, Genesis, and Proverbs, we see how we find ourselves in a fallen state, how God makes a promise to set things right, We see how God will fulfill that promise through a suffering servant and by making Abraham a father of many nations. And we see how in Proverbs, God gives us instructions in order to live holy lives in His presence. So this Lent, I hope you have a chance to do the readings that the church gives us. Do the readings daily from Isaiah, Genesis, and Proverbs, and allow them to instill in you a thirst for the divine, a thirst and hunger to experience the resurrection. Walk, if you will, metaphorically in the desert with the Hebrews, looking forward to the renewal of the covenant, a renewal of everything that God has promised. So that's why the gospel reading is taken away from us during Lent, so that we can experience this hunger and learn to draw near and closer to God and live holy lives. May God bless you all during this time of Lent and give you strength as we continue our self-quarantine, and may God heal us all. Amen.